Hi, welcome back. By now, we are assuming that you know how to create database models and how to create controllers to interface with the database. If you are not sure how to do this yet, there is a video dedicated for this section that you can find in either the YouTube channel or even on the documentation itself, either by looking at the model section or the controller section. If you have been following the YouTube channel in order, then in that case, the previous video that we saw together was all about how to create database models and how to create controllers. But we also saw immediately in the previous video how to create an authentication or how to use the authentication module that is prepackaged with Calligraphy. In the video today, we are going to look at how we could accept payments, and most specifically either credit card payments or bank account transfer payments. Calligraphy uses a third party company called Stripe. If you have not heard of Stripe before, Stripe has an absolutely great SDK or even an API that would allow handling credit card payments and other sorts of payments such as ACH and things like that. Calligraphy uses this and integrates Stripe directly into its core functionality. And what we're going to see today in the session is how to activate the Stripe component in Calligraphy and how to start using it directly through controllers, through Calligraphy controllers. So we're going to go ahead and do this together. I will first point out the section that is dedicated to explaining how the payment works in Calligraphy, and that would be a section called Stripe Payment, which right now is section 11, but this might change depending on how the documentation grows. So if you go into that section, it's really explaining step by step what needs to be done in order to, one, activate the payment gateway, and to start creating transactions. Okay, what we are going to do in the session today is going to be exactly what this page contains. Before we start, one thing that you need to be aware of, since Stripe is a third party that we're using, you need to have a Stripe account. Okay, it's very easy to open a Stripe account and it's free of charge. So if you go to stripe.com and you create an account, at some point you will get to a page like this, which is your home and your main dashboard. And then when you get there, there are certain pieces of information that you need in order for you to link it to Calligraphy. So here's what you need to do. You first need to go to the developer section. Under the developer section, there's another submenu called API keys. When you click on the API keys, Stripe will provide you with a set of, with a pair of keys. One of them is public and one of them is secret. Okay, this is the publishable key, meaning the public key, and this is the secret one. Okay, in order to see the secret one, you need to click on the reveal test key token, and you need those two tokens, and I will show you now in Calligraphy where you need to have them. So we will go through these steps together. Now Stripe has two modes of behavior. There is the sandbox behavior, which is meant for testing purposes and for your development environment, and there's the production mode. Okay, in order to switch between the test and the production, there's a toggle that you find in the menu of Stripe that's called View Test Data. When this is on, just like this case right now, it would show you any data that is relevant to the test environment. So these keys, for instance, are the keys that are relevant for testing. Okay, if you want to get the keys that are relevant for the production, then you will switch that toggle, and right now it is showing the keys that are meant for production purposes. For the sake of this video, we are dealing with a development environment, so with the local environment. So we are going to be using the test data by Stripe. So I do need this toggle to be on test data, and I do need the test tokens. Okay, I will reveal it for the time being just to copy it, and then I will refresh the page, and I will need these two tokens, and I need to use them in Calligraphy. So let's go to the calligraphy code. The last time we left off, we were working with the routes and we were creating our own user controller route for authentication purposes. This code, for the time being, we're not going to touch. We're not going to do anything with it. We're going to create something completely different that is meant for payment and payment only. Okay, so anything that we've done in the past was more of a learning. There's no sequence or flow or any final application that we're creating at this stage. So we are going to handle the payment in a separate controller on its own. With that said, how do we link Stripe or the Stripe gateway to Calligraphy? And most of it is really done in the .env, I would say. When you go to the .env file, there is a pay bucket or a set of pay statements at the bottom of the .env file. And this is two pairs of keys, public and private, one for the production key and another one for the test key. The ones we need to fill as part of this session is the test. Okay, you do not need to provide at this stage the production one. However, if at some point you do have a production environment while you're looking at this video, then it would be good to fill them both and then to see how Calligraphy can make the difference between a production and a test environment to use the appropriate keys. So this is where you enter the public key from Stripe, and this is where you enter the secret key from Stripe, and both need to be for the test. If you need the production ones, then don't forget you need to get it from the Stripe website, and you need to go. You need to make sure that the toggle, the view test data toggle, is turned off. Okay, in order for you to see the production keys. After you've done this, now we need a way to tell Calligraphy to make a distinction between the test and the production. And really that distinction is done under the app _env, okay? In this particular case, we are in a local environment, in a dev environment, and therefore automatically Calligraphy will be taking the test keys, the test pair of keys. When you switch this to production, so you literally need to type production in here like that, okay? Then it will take the production set of values. It needs to be production, otherwise it will always be taking the test. In our case, we are going to use the test keys, and therefore we're going to keep it to the app _env to be local. Okay, you could also enter dev here if you want. For as long as it's not production, it will always pick up the test pair of keys. Great. So now that this is done, the next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we have a controller that is handling those payments. So let's go ahead and create a controller together. We will still do it under the posters folder. Why? Because this is where we're doing most of the files or most of the classes that we're creating. So let's go ahead and create our payment controller PHP, and just like any controller in Calligraphy, this controller will also extend the core class controller. So far, there is nothing magic. And then there is a function in there called public function index. And in this function, there are two things that we need to do. And let's assume that this is the function that will handle the transaction. There are two things and two main things that we absolutely need to do. One, we need to activate the payment gateway. And in order for us to do this, there is a function in the controller, which if you go to the controller documentation, you can find it there, and it's called activate payment. Okay, what this activate payment is going to do, it's going to create the gateway with the gateway with Stripe. So it's going to create the connection with Stripe, and it's going to make it available to our controller. Okay, so after this is done, then now there is a payment property within the controller that we can start using and apply the Stripe methods to it. So great, how do we use it? After we've done this, this is what we need to do. We first need somehow to create, in our case, either the account object, let's call it this way, which is the Stripe object, and that Stripe object is an array, okay? And that array, there's always an element in it that is either a card or a bank account. Okay, in our case we are going to use credit cards, so it's going to have a card item, and that card item is an array, and that array has several properties. Now you're going to ask me, but how can you get all these properties of a credit card? In fact, Stripe provides you with all this information, so you can find it in the Stripe documentation, which is, if I go to the Stripe, you go to the top right over here, there is a very, very extensive and exhaustive documentation about the API, and I strongly encourage you to look at it and to understand the different objects of Stripe before using the calligraphy functionality. However, if you don't want to, go through the hassle of going to Stripe and all of that, in the calligraphy documentation, you also, if I go to Stripe Payment, you also have a description of what the credit card components are. And these really are, these are the credit card components. So for the card, you need to give it a number, which is the credit card number. You need to give it an expiry month, an expiry year, and a CVC. The CVC, if you're not familiar with that term, it's also known as the CSV, and this is the verification code. Those verification codes depends on the type of credit cards. So on the American Express, they are in the front, and in the Visa and in the MasterCard, you can find them in the back of the card. Okay, so these are the components that you need to enter for the card type. So let's go ahead and take these, and then I will copy and change the values these values over here. So we will do the necessary changes as we go. Now, these are different properties and for a card type in Stripe. And what we need to do, and this is slightly different than what the documentation is doing, we need to hard code directly the value. Why? Because we do not have a form at this point of the game where the users are entering their credit card numbers and so on through a form. Okay, the documentation assumes that there is a form behind, and what it does is it gives you the code on how you should do it to get and to fetch that information from the user. But for our purposes, since we are not going to create any views or any forms at this stage of the game, we are going to immediately hard code the values. And to hard code the values for the test data through Stripe, Stripe gives us a dummy credit card to use, and that dummy credit card number is given to you in the documentation as well. So if I go back here, there's something called test data. If you look at credit card number, it's a 42, 42, 42, 16, so 8 times. And then the expiry year can be any year in the future, so is the month. And then the CSV, it could be any combination of 3 or 4 digits. Okay, so we're going to use that to hard code it. So we're going to do 42, 42, 42, 42. For the expiry month, we can put any month between 1 and 12. So, let's put 10. And then for the year, I would suggest that you put any year in the future. Okay. And then for the CSV, it could be any set of digits. So let's put, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. Okay. And let's save that. Now we have our account object, if you may, or our card object in this particular case. Now our immediate next step is to really create a transaction with the Stripe. So like I mentioned before, is from the moment you activate the payment, now your controller is going to have a new property that is appended to it, and it's going to be called payment. And this .payment is an object, it's a Stripe object, and then you can call some Stripe transaction or methods, and one of these methods is create transaction. And create transaction takes several parameters. We're going to head back to the documentation in Calligraphy to really understand what goes into that method, and it's at the bottom of the page. So the create transaction, it takes an amount, it takes a currency, it takes an object, a card object, and you can rely on the Stripe documentation to see how to do that, but we just created a card together. And then there's a set of other optional fields that you can enter. So some of them can be some metadata that you might need with the transaction. Those can be any pairs any pairs of object literals that you might need to track your data or for reporting purposes. And then it could have a description that you can also pass on to this method, and it will be visible to you at the dashboard level whenever you need it in Stripe. So in our case, we're just going to keep them empty. We're just going to enter an amount, a currency, and then the card. So what is the amount? The amount is always in cents. So if I want to do $10, then it's going to be 1,000 cents. And then the currency where I am standing, it's USD. And then we're going to pass the account object to it. And ideally, this should be it, okay? And look at it. In 2-3 statements, we were able to actually create a transaction and a charge on a credit card. Now, we are going to need to dump the value just to see whether it worked or it didn't work. For us to test, and then I'll show you where you can see in Stripe how you can see this charge of $10. Alright, so far we're done with our controller. Now we need to create a router, just like we do in most of the controllers that we create. So we're going to go in there and we're going to say, let's create a route, call it pay, and then this route is going to go to payment controller. And we don't need to specify a method because our payment is done in an index method. So with that, ideally, the code should work, unless of course I've done some mistakes along the way. So let's see. Oops, sorry, posters / pay. Don't forget the posters / pay. Ooh, action success, true, data, and it gave me the confirmation. So ideally my transaction did pass and I did make the payment. So now if I go to Stripe and we go to home, okay, look at it. So home on the top, it tells there's a timeline that's showing you hour by hour what's happening on the day. And over here, it just measured a transaction that we just made, which happens to be at 1:51 p.m. right now. And it's a charge of, am I able to see the values somewhere? No, I am not. Well, actually, yeah, maybe here I can see it. So that would be yesterday, and this is today, 2 p.m. Okay, that's at $10. This is exactly the amount that we just entered. So voila, this is really how we create a transaction in Calligraphy. You see how easy it is. In a couple of statements, we were capable of charging a credit card. So what did we learn today? What we learned is that obviously Calligraphy uses a Stripe third-party tool that is seamlessly integrated in this framework. And then in order for us to use that component, we definitely need to have an account in Stripe. We need to get the keys from Stripe, and then we need to put these keys and populate them in our .m file in order for us to create a link with the Stripe component. Once we've done that, our first step in the controller, whenever we decide what controller we want to use to handle the payment, once we have that, then the first thing we need to do is we need to activate the payment. The reason why we need to activate the payment is to make the Stripe object available in the context of the controller that we're using. Second, we need to create an account object or a Stripe object, and that Stripe object can be a card, it can be an ACH transaction, meaning it's a banking transfer, or Stripe has some more objects that you can go ahead and take a look at. And once we defined, what sort of transaction, what sort of Stripe object we want to create, then each one of those objects has a set of properties of their own. If you're testing, you need to hard code these values. In the case of a credit card, it needs a number, it needs an expiry month, it needs a year, and it needs a verification code. Stripe does have some dummy data for testing purposes, so you could use these dummy cards or dummy bank account numbers for you to test out whether the transaction worked or not. Okay, once you create that object, now it's about time to call in a charge, so really to create a charge through calligraphy. And in order for you to do that, there is a method called create transaction within the stripe object that is contained within calligraphy. And that stripe object, you can get it by calling this payment. So payment is a property of the controller that becomes only active whenever the payment is activated, and it will start having a value, and or it becomes an object. And when it becomes an object, then in that case you could apply the create transaction, which is really the only method that you need in order to seamlessly interact and interface with Stripe. Now the create transaction, it takes an amount, it takes a currency, and it takes the object, the Stripe object that you want to pass, whether it's a card or whether it's a bank account. And then it takes some other optional arguments which you could check in the documentation, and that is mainly for either reporting purposes or auditing purposes. And with that, this is exactly what we wanted to show you today. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope it worked for you. If you have any questions or if you have any issues, please don't hesitate to reach out to us through the regular channels. With that, I wish you a great day.